The next witness is former Mayor of Harrisburg, Steve Reed. Good afternoon.
How are you doing?
Good. If you'd like to raise your right hand and be sworn.
Sure.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do so swear.
Thank you. Do you have any prepared statement or want to discuss anything before we ask a few questions?
Short prepared comments. I wrote it this morning, so I apologize to the executive director, wherever he's at. I didn't turn it in before.
That's all right. That's fine.
You'll bear with me. I did bring extra copies with me. Chairman Eichelberger, Minority Chairman Blake, and members of the Senate Local Government Committee. The Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility, which opened in the early 1970s, provided an alternative to the landfilling of municipal solid waste. From its initiation to present day, it is a sophisticated set of components and operations. The United States Congress adopted and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency subsequently implemented a variety of changes and more restrictive standards regarding emissions in the 1990s, which would affect not only the Harrisburg facility, but a host of others across the nation. This enactment in Washington gave rise to the planning and the ultimate undertaking of the retrofit and upgrade to the Harrisburg facility. In the course of that planning, a variety of options were considered, including, for example, a process that involved solid waste disposal using a gasification technology. Also considered was the retention of the existing technology, the existing type of operation, but putting in new replacement equipment, as well as other options. A process using forced air that provided better control of the incineration of waste was the project ultimately selected. It was in use elsewhere and was considered a better way to dispose of waste through its patented newer technology. The planned retrofit and upgrade of the facility using this technology was subsequently the subject of many a public meeting and hearing. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, as required, conducted its own public meetings, as did City Council, the Harrisburg Authority, and the county. At the very heart of the issue of the significantly higher costs, and therefore the higher borrowing, the subject of this hearing that the project precipitated, is the question of how the initial project costs would be so underestimated. To this day, I have never heard a complete answer to this question. The inventor who developed and had already put the newer technology into use had devised the initial project cost estimate and was to be the one to implement the project. When City Council reviewed this project in detail and at length, they hired their own independent engineering firm to review the project plan. The Dauphin County Commissioners separately hired their own independent engineering firm to do exactly the same thing. Additionally, the Harrisburg Authority's engineering firm reviewed the project. At the public meetings and hearings, the project details, including costs, which were a matter of full public record for review, was not questioned or challenged. In no independent review, nor in any testimony or submittals, was there a conclusion or a warning that the project was significantly underestimated in costs, and that the project would therefore be far more expensive to undertake. The decision makers in this matter, including the City Council, County Commissioners, the Harrisburg Authority Board members, and the Mayor, are not engineers and would not have specialized knowledge to assess a cost estimate on a project of this sophistication and technology. Absent any information to the contrary, there was not an open question of project costs being too low during the decision-making process. Had there been, and if the much higher project costs were known at the outset, I think it pretty accurate to say that this project would not have been started. An alternative would have had to have been selected, possibly involving the creation of a new landfill in the area, as the question of how to dispose of municipal solid waste still had to be addressed by one means or another. Having an upfront, accurate cost estimate is obviously key to this entire matter because all the financing decisions later flow from it. Not having accurate upfront estimates, resulting in far higher costs later to complete the project, would have and has had a cascading adverse effect on the facility debt load. I would therefore make the following suggestions. Number one, that the Local Government Unit Debt Act be amended. We have fairly consistent cost measures and standards for conducting such capital projects as water and sewer and road construction. The various industries that do those types of works have some pretty basic models of what it costs to do those sorts of things. This, however, is far less true when it comes to more specialized capital projects that are not widely undertaken, such as the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facilities retrofit and expansion. So I would suggest that as and when more specialized projects come for submittal to the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development as required by current law, that the law should be amended to further require that the cost estimates shall be specifically reviewed and verified by an independent reviewer or a panel selected by DCED, who would be expert in the specialized area of construction that is being submitted for DCED review. This review should be automatic, so as to negate any new costs to taxpayers for doing such a review. The costs of this review should be borne by the applicant submitting the project debt plan to DCED. Presently, DCED has a limited time during which to accept and act on any debt submittals. In order to conduct the type of review suggested now, the law should be amended to grant DCED the additional time necessary to do that more intensive analysis. As and when cost estimates are verified as credible, DCED can then act to approve the debt issuance. If found not to be credible, DCED would have the option to deny the filing. And number two, further, the Local Government Unit Debt Act should be amended to further set forth that for such specialized projects that require this type of intensive cost estimate review by a reviewer or review panel, that any debt that is listed as self-liquidating for that project would also be subject to the same type of verification, which could be done by a reviewer separate from and in addition to members reviewing the cost estimates, which will be, of course, at the option of DCED to determine. This, too, should be automatic. These statutory amendments are aimed at preventing a recurrence of the experience involving the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility, and I would be pleased to assist the committee and its staff in drafting a mandatory language. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Senator Blake, do you have some questions?
Mr. Mayor, thank you for your presence here and your testimony. I began my remarks earlier today thinking about the good intentions that were at the origin of this project, and as as Attorney Goldfield mentioned earlier, that it was a series of disasters, and I expect as you look back in retrospect, that's pretty much your sentiment as well as it relates to the impact it's had on your taxpayers in the city of Harrisburg.
Absolutely.
The thing I guess I'm curious about most is the level of confidence you had in the recommendations you were making to council, whether you felt council and you were adequately informed. I think you've heard the chairman quiz our previous testifier on this matter. Did you feel you had the information you needed in order to make the judgments and the recommendations that were being made for the decisions that the local governing body had to make?
At the time of making recommendations to City Council and others, we felt that the information in hand was valid and accurate and comprehensive. Yes.
Was there any time?
Let me put it another way. If we had any idea that the project, the Barlow project, was going to cost what it ultimately did cost, we wouldn't have pursued it. It would never have been initiated. We had no information from any of the independent engineering analyses, from any source saying to us, whoa, take a look at this project closer. The costs are significantly underestimated. It's going to cost you a lot more. If we had known that, I can tell you categorically, the project would never have been started.
Understood. I think the other thing that I guess I'm curious about is this, and I posed this question to Mr. Clark earlier, is was there ever a time when you or council knew that there wasn't a performance bond on, between the authority and Barlow?
Heard about it after the fact.
Only after the fact. Understood. I guess the thing that jumped out in some of the earlier testimony too, and forgive me, Mr. Mayor, because it's just my interpretation of reading the forensic audit as the deal for the sake of a deal. I think that there continued to be, your words, cascading crisis, meaning you get pushed a little further, you have additional obligations, another obligation has to be made. But clearly, we've taken a look at the forensic audit, and there's some $13–14 million worth of fees paid to the firms that were involved. No one had questioned the projections. We've heard from earlier testimony that there was no question of the projections that were made, and the issues associated with guarantee fees, both back to the guarantors, in favor of getting a better deal in capital markets, but at the same time costing the city more. I guess I'm wondering, what your take is in retrospect on the nature of the transactions that kind of gave you and probably the county a little bit of a break in some of the more tough decisions you had to face with respect to your own budgets.
Well, we were told, we meaning the city, was told, and I know that the county was told the same thing, as was the Harrisburg Authority advised, that if you have in the issuance of bonds, in this case for a resource recovery facility, that if there are guarantees from governing bodies of different taxing jurisdictions, in this case the city and the county, and supplemented further, as was the case for most or many of these bonds, bond insurance on top of it, that you get a pretty favorable interest rate in the market. That it's cheaper to sell those bonds than if you go out on a standalone credit basis.
Let me ask you this. One of the operative language in the exchange I had with our first testifier this morning about the forensic audit was the issue of the reliance upon those guarantees without an appropriate appreciation for the underlying cash flows of the facility. Two things are happening here. You're being told by your professionals that this is going to work.
Yes.
The other thing you're being told by your professionals is that your guarantee helps it happen. And I guess I'm trying to reconcile in some way, and I'm sure that you see this in retrospect, that you almost were an enabler by virtue of your goodwill to make it possible for the capital markets to meet the project at that time. And at the end of the day, there was never a cash flow, there was never an analysis that challenged the projections about the cash flow of the facility. And then again, it was the guarantees that drove the borrowing and not the cash flow.
And there would have been another thing that probably drove the review by the capital market, and that would have been the rate covenants of the Harrisburg Authority, because they had the right to set rates for the disposal of municipal solid waste and the other types of waste that the facility would have been permitted to incinerate, to process. The cash flow analyses actually was the cumulative work of the project financial advisors, attorneys, the investment bankers involved in the sale of the project bonds. At that time, hindsight being 20/20, at that time, there was no information in front of any of us, Harrisburg Authority, county, or the city, saying to us, these numbers do not work, that the actual cash flows will be whatever, that will be substantially different. Just as a side note to that, I remember one of the pro formas, and I don't remember, was it 2003, 2007, or whatever, making a projection as to the annual income of the facility once it would be retrofitted and completed. And it was estimating it in the neighborhood of $25 million. I remember the number because it's such an easy number to remember. It's actually taking in more than that today. And the technology involved in this project actually works, and has gotten some pretty favorable reviews, not the debt, but the technology of how the plant operates has gotten some fairly favorable reviews in the solid waste disposal industry. So some of that which was projected back then, on which obviously we had reliance, did turn out to be true.
Time is money.
Yes, you aren't kidding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely.
Senator Fulmer.
Yes, I have several questions. Thank you for being here today. Given your comments about the lack of warnings about the incinerator financing, how do you explain the 2007 refinancing, which the forensic audit states it should have been clear to the authority, the city, the county, and their advisors that the net revenues would not be sufficient to pay the existing debt and that the facility had no prospect of generating income from operations. Despite these indications, the authority issued the 2007 debt, and the city and the county provided guarantees of those repayments.
Well, I can tell you that at that time, there was not any report, any information from any source in front of the county or the city or the Harrisburg Authority that I've ever heard of or seen that said that the cash flow projections and the other pro forma data was invalid. We can look back on it these years later and say, yeah, it wasn't correct. But at that time, that's what we had in front of us.
Well, see, on page 106 of the forensic audit, at the top, it would be the first full paragraph. It says, in the documents that have been produced to date, we have identified 17 sets of financial projections that were prepared in the 2007 for the period of 2007 through 2011. Under all 17 sets of projections, the RRF would not generate income sufficient to service the existing debt and the new debt that was contemplated.
My recollection is that I don't know which document you're referring to because I don't remember it, but my recollection is that that document included also supplemental information talking about the rate covenants. In other words, the ability of the authority to exercise its rate-making authority to fill in the gap. As a matter of fact, the Harrisburg Authority subsequently took action to do exactly that. Got into a whole quagmire with the county over it, but that's another story. But
Just changing it a little bit here with my next question. Would you explain the CIT deal? Specifically, whose idea was it? How was it done? Who was involved? And what were the goals and objectives of the CIT deal?
I had never heard of CIT. James Barlow, who was the principal of the Barlow project, had apparently done business with them elsewhere, or knew of them, had some familiarity with them. And CIT apparently had an appetite, if you would, for studying and financing energy-related projects. Barlow Associates brought CIT into the picture. The city played almost no role in the discussions with them. I do not recall ever meeting the folks from CIT. Why was CIT financing sought by the project? Why was it approved by the Harrisburg Authority? Very simply because they needed the money to complete the project. As simple as that.
Okay.
If I can add something to that, I remember this discussion ad nauseum, that at the time, the project was well more than half completed, if my memory is correct, and it had run out of money, so it needed more money, good Lord. Mind-boggling and extraordinarily outraging to all of us. So the question was, do you complete the project so that there's a revenue-producing asset in place, or you just simply stop the project and it never would be completed? The decision was to finish the project.
Well, I mean, as I talk to you and others involved in these transactions, the common theme is that no one did anything wrong. If that's true, how did the city, the authority, and the county end up with the huge financial challenges they are now facing?
Because the initial cost estimate for the project to retrofit and expand the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility was significantly underestimated. That is the genesis of all of this.
All right, then, would you explain your rationale for the guarantee fees the city charged? I'm especially interested in your thoughts on the forensic audit's comments on these fees, which states, and I quote, "The guarantee fees added more debt on the incinerator and more cost to the financing, but provided little, if any, benefit to the retrofit project."
My recollection of the guarantee, I don't know what the county did with their guarantee fee. My recollection of the city's guarantee fee was that it was used to cover the cost of some of the resource recovery facility employees that had been retained by the city and assigned to other departments awaiting their return to the expanded and retrofitted facility.
Okay, thank you very much.
How about we go back to when the city owned the incinerator?
Yes.
Why would the city sell that asset at that point?
Because it was my view that a municipal government is not an appropriate entity to both own and operate such a facility. That an authority, or frankly, preferably a private enterprise, would have a more latitude and more capacity to own and provide for the operation of the facility. And incidentally, the ultimate plan following the retrofit and expansion was and should be, and as far as I know, it still is, to transfer the ownership, to sell it to the private sector. I am more than fully convinced that a governmental body owning and operating a facility that's that sophisticated is probably not a good idea. That the larger entities in the private sector that have a presence in the solid waste disposal industry, and there are at least 3 that come to mind, are far better positioned, far better capitalized, and in a far better position to create the efficiencies, frankly, that government cannot create. So the ultimate objective, and we said this publicly on multiple occasions, was to eventually sell the facility. And it should be sold, should be privately owned and operated.
Do you remember at the time if there was a profit made on the sale to the city?
On the sale. I think the answer is yeah. I'm not 100% sure. We're talking about 1992 or 1993. Somewhere it's
93.
93. I probably shouldn't guess at the answer. The answer is I don't know off the top of my head. I'd want to do some checking first.
Yeah. And I was curious too, if you could shed any light on any conversations you had with the county. I mean, the county and Commissioner Hayes was supposed to be here today, but had a personal issue, and he's going to be at our next hearing.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, for the county to step into this and take on that obligation, that liability, you know, that's a risk for a government entity. You were in a different position as the city. You had the incinerator. You created the authority. You were integrally part of the situation. They weren't. So, how did that come about? Did they think that they were getting? They charged a guarantee fee, but was that the sole advantage for them, or were there other advantages that they wanted to be part of this system somehow? I mean, can you shed any light on that?
Well, I'm very reluctant to speak on behalf of another entity. I do, at the time, I do know that the county was concerned that if the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility was not retrofitted and did not, and permanently closed, that it would engender the reopening of, frankly, what had been a very controversial landfill in Upper Dauphin County, called the Fulk Road landfill, if my memory is correct. And there was huge opposition to it in Upper Dauphin County. There was no other in-county alternative but the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility to the disposal of municipal solid waste for businesses and residents throughout Dauphin County. So I think that was part of, well, I know that was part of their thinking as to why they would want to see the Harrisburg Resource Recovery Facility retrofitted and expanded. As to whatever else went into their thought process, I couldn't speak to.
Getting back to a question Senator Fulmer asked about money from, you asked, Mike, did you ask about the guarantee fee money? You asked about, what did he ask you about, Mayor? He asked you about something. Guarantee fee money.
Guarantee fee money for the city.
Now, didn't that go into that special projects account? Or did some of that go into that and some of it went somewhere else?
I'm speaking off the top of my head now without the benefit of having the budget from whatever year that was. My best recollection is that the guarantee fee of the city was used to offset city costs of the employees from the resource recovery plan that had not been laid off, that were reassigned to other departments during the construction period and would be returned to the facility when it was completed and open. That's my recollection.
Well, I mean, I have a memo here saying that there was $515,000 that went into a special projects account for the mayor's Wild West Museum. So, I don't know what year.
From the city's guarantee fee? That's news to me.
It says from bond issue. So I don't know what other money you would have derived from.
I don't know, and I don't remember even seeing that, frankly.
The other thing you mentioned a while ago that surprised me was when you said you didn't know about the performance bond.
Correct. Well, not at the time. I have that.
Until afterwards.
That's correct.
I mean, from what I've read, the person that was, the two people actually that were, that designed the securities walk-around agreement here, both worked under your direction, Mr. Lispy and Mr. Giorgiano. Mr. Lispy's going to talk later, so maybe we'll hear from him. But it just surprised me that you weren't aware of that at the time.
Not at the time. I learned of it later.
Okay. Well, any other questions? Yes. Go ahead, one more from.
And just to expand, just as a follow-up on the Special Projects Fund, would you explain the Special Projects Fund, how it was created, the purpose, and the uses of it?
Special Projects Fund was actually created by the Harrisburg Authority. They used it to do all manner of projects. I know the Harrisburg Authority was a sponsor of different events, community and civic projects. That would have been the funding source for that. It was a funding source for, well, let me put it this way. The Harrisburg Authority owned then, well, and still own now, the water system, which serves all or part of 5 municipalities, including all of the city, owns the wastewater treatment plant and conveyance system, which serves 7 municipalities, or part of them, and owns the resource recovery facility. The Special Projects Fund was used to fund anything that didn't have to do with water, sewer, or incinerator. So that's, I guess, the simplest explanation.
Why was that housed at the authority then instead at the city? The fund was under the control of the authority, not the city, but the city's the one who made the decisions on the money.
The city didn't make the decisions on all the money. The Special Projects Fund used authority money. It wouldn't have been part of the city budget. The city had its own special project fund as well. That would have been related almost entirely, if not exclusively, to economic development related projects, but it's authority money, so they wouldn't have sent it over to us.
But wasn't the city the one, who was making the decisions how that money was spent then?
Well, the board actually made the decisions. They voted in public session, I might add, on every allocation from all of their funds, water, sewer, incinerator, special projects fund, or any other fund that they may have had.
Okay. Okay, anything else? All right, thank you very much for being here today, Mayor. Do we have a copy of that?
Absolutely.
And our next, thank you.
You want another?
Yeah, we could take a couple, that would be helpful. And our next witness is Mr. Dan Lispy. Who's a former director of special projects for the city of Harrisburg.